So, frauders and sorors, what I have done is made a parallel with the journey of Francis of Assisi as a man of peace to our own alchemical journey and our own tradition. So, first of all, I want you to think about why we might study someone like Francis of Assisi. First, as Rosicrucian students, we are seeking enlightenment or cosmic consciousness and peace profound. We also attempt to follow a spiritual practice in everyday life. The life story of Francis evidences mystical concepts of universality that are part of the primordial tradition and the Rose Croix tradition in particular. Finally, his transformation was based on following his inner master in an attempt to perfect himself. From the Rosicrucian Code of Life, you would recognize this statement. The aim of all human beings is to perfect ourselves, to become better persons. Therefore, constantly endeavor to awaken and express the virtues of the soul that animates you. In doing so, you will contribute to your evolution and serve the cause of humanity. So, what is an alchemical journey? First of all, what we call transcendental alchemy is about transformation, transmutation, and rebirth. What is being transformed is a good question. If the inner self is gold, the outer self or personality is lead that requires transformation in its evolutionary journey, our life's path. The stages of alchemy are outlined in the most recent manifesto, the new chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. It was the original, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz was published in 1616. 400 years later, Amorg released this new alchemical wedding manifesto. You will see the phoenix on the cover, which is emblematic of rebirth. You will also see the Latin phrase below the phoenix, cosmica lex successit, meaning cosmic law fulfills. All journeys, whether far or near, constitute a quest for self-discovery. The 7 stages of alchemy can be outlined as follows, and I'm going to go through them. But you must keep in mind, of course, that your alchemical journey isn't necessarily the order in which I'm going to talk to you about, because these are the actual physical stages, but we're talking about transcendental alchemy. So the first stage is calcination, to burn or purify by fire, the dross matter of the outer self, often due to hardship, shock, or even conscious choice. Dissolution is the next stage, to dissolve the body, the outer self or outer life, in order to bind the spiritual self. Step 3 is separation. Separate the pure from the impure, the subtle from the gross. Conjunction, the search for divine union. Fermentation or putrefaction, which we also call the dark night of the soul or metaphysical death. Distillation or sublimation, the below becomes the above and the above the below. And finally, coagulation, the initiate becomes the adept, the final stage of the great work. After the Rosicrucian World Convention in Rome, several of us joined the Rosicrucian Sacred Tour of Italy. That started on August 19th in 2019. Our first stop was the medieval village of Assisi. Originally an old village even before Francis' birth, the village was named Assisi, meaning ascent. To better comprehend the life of Francis, we were housed in 2 authentic monasteries run by the Franciscan order, Monastero San Giuseppe and the Casa del Terzario. I was housed in the Casa del Terzario. I was in a single room, and these were small, like cells, with a narrow bed, a tiny desk, and a clothing cabinet, barely room for my suitcase. Each room had a window with no screen, with various views of the surrounding landscape. The stay occurred during one of the hottest summers on record. No air conditioning, but comfortable for sleep and rest. My bedspread even had a tiny rose pattern, which I really did appreciate. Meals were communal, ample, and taken on time with the sound of the bell that you see here. That's an actual photograph of the bell in the lobby of the Terzario. In this photograph, you will see fratres and sorors, along with many visitors, walking along the sidewalk of the wall there as they leave the large basilica of San Francesco. And you see also that we are at a lower part of a mountain village. And what we're going to do is a kind of physical journey that represents ascending and descending the Mountain of the Adepts. When we got to the bottom, you'll see that it was quite a hot day, the mist of humidity in the air. That's a view looking back at the large basilica. Here you see an illustration from Kabbalah, Mirror of Art and Nature, in alchemy, attributed to the Tyrolean physician Stefan Michelspacher from 1616. Now remember that Francis of Assisi was born 400 years before alchemy was put into this form during the Renaissance. But we do have alchemy, of course, existing in the Islamic world at the time that Francis was alive. So here we are, a group of fratres and sorors, and we are, in fact, wandering the Umbrian Hills. You see our Grand Master, Julie Scott, here, and we also see a number of participants. She's looking back at fratres and sorors who are coming to gather at this spot. You might recognize yourself or people you know. Now, part of the journey, of course, even though we start off as a group, means that we sometimes travel alone. We become separated from others. And certainly in this time of isolation, you might be feeling rather alone. And it may even metaphorically be a bit of a stony path as you go down alone. The question is, does anyone hear my prayer? I know many of us sometimes feel in moments of crisis or suffering that we are, in fact, very much alone. However, we can call this the dark night of the soul. It is a type of symbolic death that leads to rebirth. Such an experience can occur more than once in a lifetime, although usually there is a significant period of time or a moment in one's life when one experiences that dark night. It becomes a turning point and an opportunity for growth. Some of you are aware of the song that's very popular right now by Rag and Bone Man, I'm Only Human After All. Our outer self deals with many crises during a lifetime. And as our Grand Master pointed out from the great wisdom traditions, no man is really happy until he's dead. So you might recall that quotation. Born at Assisi in 1181, Francis made his transition on October 3rd, 1226. He was only age 44. That was the same year as the last great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, which occurred in the spring of that year, not at the same time, but in the spring of that year. Saturn and Jupiter appeared together in the morning sky then, and were likely washed out by the rays of the rising sun. So very few people likely witnessed that great conjunction. However, we all have the opportunity, if you live in an area where you can see the horizon and it's clear, to look to the west after sunset tomorrow night and see again the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. This is a significant astronomical, but also spiritual event. This is the oldest surviving depiction of Francis. It's a fresco in an abbey in Italy, painted 2 years after his transition. It's not an actual likeness, but a symbolic image. I would like to point out that Soror Eliza Cutjohn wrote a really beautiful article of Francis of Assisi, which appeared in the Rosicrucian Digest the second volume in 2018, and I marked the pages for you there. So don't worry if you don't have a chance to write that down, because remember that today's events are being recorded. Here are some traits that we commonly associate with Francis of Assisi. Compassion, especially toward animals. Although there are, of course, instances when Francis did not necessarily show compassion towards some animals. He killed an animal that had trampled another that he was particularly fond of. So as a human being, his character was also evolving over time. Love of nature is associated with Francis. Humility, vow of poverty, chastity, the practice of charity or caritas, generosity to the poor. The Franciscan Rule, one of the most widely known and popularly practiced routines or daily ritual, particularly in monasteries. The flowering of Renaissance Christian humanism, most evidenced in art and the depiction of human figures and architecture as rounded and three-dimensional. And we'll see some images later in the presentation of frescoes by Giotto. Francis was born in 1181 to a noble family during the time of the Templars. As a youth, Francis traveled to France with his father, who was a cloth merchant. His mother was likely French from Provence. There, Francis became enchanted with the music of the troubadours, part of our Rose-Croix heritage. Francis had dreams of romance and chivalry, but as a naive, youthful hero. Here's an image of courtly love, a young man playing a stringed instrument to his lady. The lady represented the divine feminine, also the soul within. And you see behind them a rose that's spiraling upward, also symbolic of the spiritual ascent. And our Rose-Croix tradition is very closely associated with the courtly love tradition. Francis became a soldier for Assisi with dreams of glory, but his army was defeated. Italy at that time was not a unified country. It was a series of city-states, often at war with each other. And as a young man, he was idealistic. He thought he could be heroic and defend the city and go to war, as many young men do. Unfortunately, he was held in prison for almost a year. This experience of war, solitude, and privation changed him. He was no longer carefree and frivolous. Calcination, the first stage in the alchemical process, recall, is to burn or purify by fire. The so-called body of matter is stressed by fire and heat, which also psychologically would cause us a great deal of stress. In alchemy, here's the king, the spiritual aspect of the self, put under pressure, in a sense, in the alchemical journey. The king is not literally destroyed, but rather we see the calcination process as the first step. If you look at this literal example, you'll see that the vegetable matter in alchemy first becomes blackened by the fire, it's darkened, and then it turns to white ash, which brings us to stage 2, dissolution. After his release from prison, Francis suffered illness. En route to a new battle, he was warned in a dream to give up his goods and plans of knighthood. He deserted, gave up his horse and his possessions. He wandered the forest surrounding Assisi, seeking enlightenment. He continued to transform in attitude during this period of change and transformation. He overcame his extreme aversion toward lepers. Now you're going to be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, she skipped stage 3. We're going to skip stage 3 for a moment, but we'll come back to that, because remember that in real life, sometimes the stages of alchemy don't necessarily follow in a chronological sequence. Stage 4 is conjunction. In this stage, the initiate seeks divine union. It's also called the lesser illumination. In the forest, Francis found a small rundown chapel of San Damiano. He knelt in front of a Byzantine-style cross, likely painted in the previous century. Francis entered a state of ecstasy and felt he heard the voice of Yeshua, who asked him to rebuild his church. This is the original chapel of San Damiano. It is now housed within the Basilica Santa Maria degli Angeli. And here's the outside of this very large basilica, and you see a statue of St. Francis, or Francis of Assisi. And here's the street view of this basilica. According to legend, the little chapel of San Damiano was erected early in before even the year 1000 by hermits from the Valley of Josaphat in Israel. The hermits were said to have brought relics from the grave of the Virgin Mary. This is the original chapel, and you get a better view here of how tiny it is and how large that basilica is that houses it today. So let's explore the interior. You will notice that the walls are rough-hewn stone. They have electric lights in there now, but when Francis stumbled upon this little chapel in the forest, it would have been very dark. This is a new altar, of course, but above it, you see this beautiful series of frescoes. Some of them depict the life and stories of Francis. We also see here the story of the Annunciation to Mary. I know you would be interested in knowing what the prayer of St. Francis is before the cross of San Damiano. Here it is. Most high and glorious God, bring light to the darkness of my heart. Give me right faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, insight and wisdom, so that I may always observe your holy and true command. Bring light to the darkness of my heart. Give me hope, insight, and wisdom. So let's go back to stage 3. Francis originally understood the message he received at the Forest Chapel literally. In order to have money for the reconstruction of the little church, which he thought he needed to rebuild, he stole cloth from his father's business. His father, outraged by his son's seemingly crazy behavior, imprisoned him in their house. Francis' mother, however, released her son. Father, however, had the son publicly tried in the town square. And here you see a bronze statue representing Francis' parents. The father holding the clothes of Francis, and the mother here chains, symbolic of her releasing him. Stage 3 is really about separation. In front of many witnesses, when he was on trial in the public square, Francis rejected his father by stripping naked. The local bishop, also present, covered Francis, and you see that in this beautiful fresco by Giotto. In covering Francis with his own cloak, the bishop is said to have understood the concept of the Holy Spirit inspiring Francis, or as we would say, the Master within, or God within. In publicly rejecting his parents, mainly his father, and naming the God of his heart as his true father, Francis is said to have emulated the example of Yeshua. Francis thus became free to follow his own path. After his falling out with his father Pietro, Francis wandered, not sure how to proceed. Over time, Francis understood that what he was asked to do was renew the church as a metaphysical concept, not as a literal concept. His sorte sacrée, or sacred way, of the Franciscan Rule was developed intuitively. Francis opened a Bible at random, the New Testament, to verses that inspired him. In Mark, give all you have and follow me. In Luke, take nothing for the road. In Matthew, to follow me, take up my cross. He meditated for a year, then asked the Pope of the time if his direction was correct. The Pope granted him a small place and 11 brothers to begin his order and institute his rule. So counting Francis, they formed a close circle of 12. This is now stage 6, distillation or sublimation, in which all that is now pure is circulated within the hermetically sealed alembic, a rotation that further exalts that which is distilled. The below becomes the above, and the above the below. This is taken from the Book of Alchemy, a wonderful resource, beautifully illustrated with old plates, diagrams, and photographs by Francis Melville. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of the Poor Clares. This is the Basilica of Clare of Assisi. She ran away from her parents. She was supposed to wed a man she did not wish to marry, an older man, and she did not love him and felt truly constrained by this. And at that time, women didn't have a lot of choice. But Clare had heard Francis preach and was inspired by his example. So he gave her refuge among his monks. She dressed as a monk and had her hair cut. Thus began the Order of the Poor Clares in 1212, just 3 years after the Franciscan order was founded. And here you see another of the frescoes. This is from the Church of San Damiano. This is also a story of alchemical separation, distillation, and conjunction. The Poor Clares are an order of Franciscan nuns. They still exist today. They dedicate themselves to vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which brings me to the Franciscan Rule. A rule is a series of practices followed in daily life by those who live a monastic existence with emphasis on work and worship. Activities are ordered according to time of day. Earlier, the Knights Templar also followed a rule established by Bernard of Clairvaux around 1128. Bernard experienced the divine in a mystical and intuitive manner and praised the Knights Templar for their imitation of Yeshua, or what we call emulating the Christ consciousness. The Franciscan Rule was approved by Pope Innocent III in 1209. The members would own no property, individually or communally. They would wander, healing the sick and begging for their food and performing charitable acts. I thought you might be interested to see this publication from 1895 in Rome. It is of the Franciscan Rule, and it says it's for fratres and sorors, or the Italian version, fratelli e sorelle. We also practice a kind of rule at a silent retreat center, the Rosicrucian Domaine du Silence in Quebec, Canada. There's also one in Brazil, where members of the Rosicrucian order can go to meditate, to walk in nature, to review their monographs, and to experience convocations, that is, ritual meditations that are very important to our tradition. Here are the 3 vows, and they relate to the Franciscan robe and cordelier. Poverty, which means living a simple lifestyle. Chastity, which refers to a higher love. And here's a quotation that describes really what that in essence is about. A consecrated chastity, loving all, possessing no one, striving sincerely for singleness of heart, a celibate way of loving and being loved. Finally, obedience to God, to the community, to the church, and at least for most of us as the developing mystics, to the self or the inner self. I do want to comment here that the Rosicrucian order does not espouse that we live in poverty, but that we do attempt to simplify our lifestyle and lead a more spiritual life. The 3 knots on the cordelier represent those 3 vows of the Franciscan monk. And here you see the cordelier tied around the robe. And here we have a case, a glass case at the Terzario where I was staying that was paid homage to a particular Franciscan monk that they revered. We also see there are excerpts from his letters. That was his Franciscan robe and the cordelier. This brings us to the Franciscan cross, or Tau. Some say that the Franciscan cross or Tau is a representation of the brown robe worn by Francis that inspired him to create this symbol. That's at least what our guide told us when we were in Assisi. However, others understand its meaning as the true cross of the crucifixion, since historically the Romans crucified martyrs on a T and not a cross. The cross itself, with the vertical and horizontal, is a primordial symbol, which has significant spiritual meaning. However, the Tau, or Tav, is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet and has special symbolic significance. Please, if you have an opportunity, look at Rosicrucian TV on YouTube and see the 231 Gates meditation that Grandmaster Julie Scott performs. And it's a special meditation which also will familiarize you with some of the sounds of the Hebrew alphabet. This letter has similar significance in the Greek alphabet as the final omega, and thus also represents the Christ consciousness. I am the Aleph and the Tav should remind you of the Greek phrase, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. In stage 7, coagulation, the initiate becomes the adept. There are many famous quotations attributed to Francis, but the most important to our order are the morning prayer and the canticle of the creatures. Here are 2 others. Where there is charity and wisdom, there is neither fear nor ignorance. All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of a single candle. Here's an excerpt from the Canticle of the Creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially brother's son, who is the day through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you most high, he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister moon and stars. In the heavens you have made them bright, precious, and fair. The Canticle to the Creatures should remind us of the hymn to Aton by Akhenaton. Worship Re in his name as Shu, Lord of light and air, who is in the Aton, living forever and ever. Thy rising is beautiful in the horizon of heaven, O Aton, ordainer of life. One God, like whom there is no other. Thou didst create the earth by thy heart or will. Yet you are alone, rising in your manifestations as the living Aton. You are my desire. Now, you may have thought that I skipped stage 5, but I'm going to address it again here briefly in the life of St. Francis, the dark night of the soul. The last remains of an ancient oak wood that surrounded the original chapel are preserved here at the Basilica Santa Maria dell'Angeli. And according to this story, one night, tempted by carnal desire, Francis rolled naked in thorny brambles, and they became thornless roses. In this story, the dark night transforms into the golden dawn. Now, close your eyes where you can actually leave them open, because I'm going to show you a few scenes from the village of Assisi while I read to you the morning prayer by Francis. Many of you will recognize it because it's also repeated at the Domain of Silence in Quebec. I know Frater Shilluli, I want to thank you for your beautiful presentation and all the others who preceded you as well, because you have written an article which appeared in the Rosicrucian Digest about this very prayer. It is by Francis of Assisi. God of my heart, in the silence of the day that dawns, I come to ask of you peace, wisdom, and strength. Today, may I look at the world with eyes filled with love. May I be patient, understanding, kind, and wise. May I see your children beyond appearances as you yourself see them, and therefore see only good in each one. Close my ears to slander. Keep my tongue free of malicious words. May only thoughts of blessing remain in my mind. May I be so kind and so joyous that all those who approach me feel thy presence. Clothe me with your beauty, God of my heart, that throughout this day I may reveal thee. So mote it be. Now, frauders and sorors, I have perhaps 10 more slides, but I need to stop now. And I want you to feel that kind of deep attunement and communion with Francis, because he certainly was a master mystic who listened to the voice of his inner master.